This program is supported in part by a grant from the Alabama Humanities Foundation, a state program of the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Yes, sir. I grew up sailing this bay. My granddaddy was harbor master in Mobile, and his daddy was a bar pilot. Although during the war between the states, he found the blockade running to be a more lucrative trade. There's a lot of stories out there. You know that the Corps of Engineers has counted 282 shipwrecks around this bay. Every one of them tells a story. And there's university professors and shrimpers and sailors and fishermen and old salts like me. All of us got stories, and some of them are even true. Stories about Mobile Bay and the way it was.
Had not had a hurricane in 50 years. And that's a very interesting story. We had the Archbishop Thomas Tulin, who came here Catholic bishop. He came here in 1926, which was our last devastating hurricane. And when he saw the condition of the town, with what the winds had done, he petitioned or told the nuns to start praying to keep the big winds away, and they prayed for 50 years. And then the old Archbishop died, and they got a new one in here. And he didn't last very long, and when Bishop May, that's who it was, left, he was here about 2 years, I guess, and he said, "One hurricane and you're out," as he got on the plane to leave to Chicago.
Just because those good sisters' prayers kept the big storms away for almost 50 years after the hurricane of 26, don't make the mistake of thinking that there wasn't any sin going on around Mobile Bay. The 1926 hurricane just happened to be right in the middle of the Roaring Twenties, and the Volstead Act forbade the production or importation of alcoholic beverages in the United States. It was called prohibition.
And so it entailed a lot of rum running, and Mobile being on the bay and the river was a prime source for smuggling bootleg whiskey from Central America and Cuba into the United States. And many people locally were involved in that. Some very prominent people, including congressmen and local society members. Not that they were bad people, but they had their own view of what was the custom and what was not the custom, and they continued to do as they had always done and convinced themselves that this was not a big deal.
Out in the Gulf at that time, a three-masted schooner laid out at 12 miles out. It's Prohibition time, and they sold alcohol in a 3-gallon container. And one trip coming back, I seen a boat coming along, and he said, "Slow down." Oh, he said, "Stop, I want to get aboard." Revenue man. And he said, "We hear you hauling alcohol." I said, "No, he ain't got no noise." Well, down in the bottom of the boat, our flooring is that far up, and them drums set there. and we put it under them drums. Them guys didn't have no way to move them drums, you know. So I said, no, we ain't hauling none. I said, come aboard and look. So I slowed down to one engine, and they hung his boat behind, a small revenue boat. And they searched the boat, they never had found her. And so we come on home. I wasn't fooling with it, but my brother was.
Now this elegant little gentleman's motor launch wasn't built to smuggle in bootleg whiskey, but long about the same time she became the center of illicit romance and murder.
And sure enough, there had been a murder and this boat was connected, but he was not killed on this boat. But the boat did fall into it. And what had happened, the judge was a police judge. He was also like a loan shark. This young lady had come to him at the age of 13, borrowed $30 to go to teacher school. She come back at a later date and told him that she could not pay the money back. Well, the good judge, being the generous kind man that he was, told her that was all right, that they would work something out, that he could take care of her in a grand style. And this was probably 1911, 1912. And he had this boat built for them in 1914. This is where they had their rendezvous. And they had this big thing, and this boat was where they had all this going on. In 1931, he was paying her $65 a week, staying in Atmore, Alabama. Said he was tired. So the paper said that he'd wrote her that he could not take no more of this, that for her to stay there, so she could come to Mobile. Confronted him in his law office right there on St. Michael Street right here in Mobile, and had to shoot him twice in self-defense as he sat behind his desk. And the paper played it up real big. We must have an inch clippings out of the paper, which we got from the library, describing all the trials and all the lurid details of this romance. They left nothing out of any of this. And most of the evidence used against the lady in the trial was pictures of them on this boat. This come out in the main edition right before the trial, showing all the characters of the trial. This little wimpy guy here is the judge.
Now the first time that Frankie shot Johnny, he let out an awful yell. The second time that she shot him, there was a new man's face in hell. He was her man, but he was doing her wrong.
So the Merchants National Bank took the boat to settle the estate and auctioned it off. At that time, the Ladd family bought the boat in auction, and the Ladd family used it as a hunting and fishing camp, mainly up in the river delta.
Now you'll see this gentleman's motor launch often around the bay, and if you wave him down, Mr. Williams, the current owner will tell you all the lurid details of the trial and acquittal, while he shows you his impeccable restoration. His wife called it a labor of love. The Mobile Bar Pilot's brand new McManus-designed schooner, the 4th Alabama, got her commission on December the 15th, 1926, and she settled in for a long career, spanning some 62 years of service on the Mobile Bar.
We had an apprenticeship period, which was it was about a year and a half. Spent out on old Alabama, ran offshore. We ran many trips with pilots in and out of the port, running the sets in the channel and the bar, crossing the bar, and getting acquainted with the various types of weather conditions that we have in this area. The Coast and Geodetic Survey crew that comes through Mobile periodically told me that this is the roughest bar entrance on the Gulf Coast. There's a greater sea running here than anywhere else on the Gulf Coast. It's what they call Dixie Bar. It's very nasty. The old pilot boats would come by a buoy and would just stall when the current runs out. When the weather got real bad, he could cook a meal, but I don't know how he did it. He had all the pots secured on the top of the stove. And they would put a tablecloth that had been wet down real good on the table to keep the dishes from sliding off.
The most hazardous task faced every day by these brave pilots was the transfer from the pilot boat to the inbound ship, or from the outbound ship back to the pilot boat, in sea conditions ranging from placid calm to storm-tossed breakers. And more than one pilot was lost in the process, never to be seen again.
It's what they call a Jacob's ladder. You know, found out the safest way to climb a ladder is to hold on to the ropes. Don't hold on to the rung. Rungs have a habit of breaking.
And when they couldn't get off the ships, it was rough. And many, many times Daddy would fetch up in New Orleans, or maybe over in Tampa. But many, many times Daddy would call, say he was in New Orleans, that he couldn't get off the ship, and they had to just take the ship where she was going.
When it got real rough, we'd take the life preservers and sock them up under the bunk, you know, where you get out of on the side. Build it up so it wouldn't throw us out of the bunk. That was a stove that tried to keep us warm. Sometimes it got too hot in there.
In good weather, the pilots would rig an awning on deck and relax under the awning. I guess when the weather was good, other than being away from home, being on the pilot boat was a pretty good place to be. But when the weather turned sour, it was a whole nother situation. From the time of the French colonization, shipbuilding on Mobile Bay had evolved from a cottage industry that built fishing boats and small pleasure craft to a major economic component of the community. During World War I, Mobile shipbuilders turned out gunboats, small battleships, and transports.
If this bay had originally, naturally, depths of 30 or 40 feet or more, we would have had a completely different history, completely different vessel configuration. I mean, this would have been a major port anywhere in the Caribbean or the Gulf by virtue of its size. I mean, whole fleets could have come in here then. But being as shallow as it is, and the average depth being about 10 feet right now outside the channel, so this is a very strong limitation. Through the history of the commercial operation in Mobile, bays had to be dredged out beginning in about 1827. Large vessels were simply not able to get up into the main harbor inside the river.
But the bay was in, say, the docks were in constant use. And of course, they were at first private docks, which passed into city ownership in the 70s. And the city took them over and rebuilt them in the mid-80s. And they served very well down till, shipping finally outgrew the city docks potential by the 20s. And the state began building its state docks in, I think, 1923, and they finished by 27.
The governor persuaded retired General Seibert to come out of retirement to construct the docks. This was the same General Seibert who had been chief engineer on the Panama Canal.
General Seibert's impact on the bay was very important. He had built the state docks, made a firm determination and firm policy that nothing would impede the ingress and egress of ships to the state docks. The evolution of the Cochrane Bridge was a natural one in which the bay boats would move from Mobile to Point Clear, Mobile to Fairhope, Point Clear, Magnolia Springs, Battles Wharf, Zundels, and it would take several hours. And people who lived over there would take the bay boat over in the evenings and back the next morning. And so that it was envisioned that the sand bars in the upper part of the bay were conducive for a causeway. And Mr. Cochrane personally raised, as I recall, $10 million. He sold bond issues for the Cochrane Bridge. And those bond issues were successful, and the bridge was built. But the interesting part about that, the state docks were another, I think it was $10 million. The Bay Bridge was only $1 million, I believe, Mr. Cochrane's bridge. Anyway, so he had to put the Bay Bridge, the Cochrane Bridge, north of the state docks. So there'd be nothing between the state docks and the open bay. Loss of the bay boats, though, was really and truly a romantic failure. There was no need for them after the Cochran Bridge. They did haul a little freight. In those days, trucks weren't as abundant as they are today. Cochran Bridge ended the bay boats.
So the bay boats hauled freight for a while and then faded into memory. And sail power gradually gave way to the gasoline engine. The beautiful old schooner Amethyst was well known on Mobile Bay for decades, and her story is typical of the change that was happening. She was called the Biloxi oyster schooner, gas-rigged and very fast. She'd been built in Bilobatry in 1863. For years she hauled oysters, raced, and on many occasions took parties of happy folks for outings on the bay. But in 1919 she caught fire.
After the masts burned out, she was burned down to the water edge. And we bought her and put her on the ways in Bilobatry and rebuilt it up to the deck. Then towed it over here and put the cabin on it. That's the Amethyst on my shipways down on the beach there. Oh, we hauled freight across there for 12 years, and that was a fine boat. We sold it to Huxford Oil Company in Mobile. The two Hanson brothers run the boat from Daphne for quite a while, and then they took it down to do some repairs on it down to Orange Beach and pulled it out, and they never did do nothing to it. And the Callaway boys put an axe to it, chopped her up.
The amethyst timbers and planks of black cypress were used for other boats. And as the years went by, fewer and fewer of the graceful schooners were to be seen on Mobile Bay.
The Starfish and Oyster Company, as far as I know, used the last ones into the about 1980. The change from two masts and went to engine power with one mast and one sail to steady the vessel when it was used for fishing.
The bay boats and the schooners weren't the only vessels on the bay that were undergoing change. There was a whole new industry coming along out there with its own specialized boats and gear.
Shrimp was almost unknown in the 19th century for pretty good reasons. Catching shrimp in commercial quantities depended on technology that wasn't available then. Namely, a technique for deeper trawling. A deep water trawl net was devised, and the ship engines that could drag it about 1912.
The change from shrimping took place, as I understand it, around 1913, 14, 15 in there, when what's called the otter trawl was developed over on East Florida and then introduced into the Gulf Coast, and then it was adapted here for dragging the net in fairly shallow water.
My father made the first shrimp net that was used in Alabama in 1913. Now, they didn't invent the net. The man that they were working for, building shrimp seines in his seine loft, heard about it, and he ordered one. And they took it apart at the seams and figured out how it was made, and thereafter began to make them. And golly, it's gone a long way since then. It's called a box net now. I've had folks come in and say, "Could you make me one of those new type nets, that box net?" I said, "Yeah, I guess so. I could make one of those."
And then in the 1930s, larger shrimp were discovered offshore, and then that's reflected in larger vessels and more complicated fishing gear and larger equipment all the way around. So shrimping underwent change within about 20, 25 years. The old Biloxi lugger. Originally, the bay shrimpers and sound shrimpers used a single net. Now they use a double net hanging out usually off both sides or Sometimes a smaller vessel will use a single net pull behind the boat. The use of double nets has the wheelhouse was moved to the forward of center, and that left the deck completely, well, more workspace in the back of the vessel.
I guess it really goes back to finances, trying to make a living, trying to make a few dollars. And it got to where the smaller boats, it was, you had to go farther, going out in the Gulf, and those brown shrimp, when they hatch out in the spring of the year, by early part of June, they move out into the Gulf of Mexico. And it gets rough out there. And those 35, 40, 45 foot boats just were not big enough really to survive out there. And now the boats are big enough that it's got to be storming pretty bad that they don't just keep right on towing their nets and catching shrimp.
But as shrimping grew into a major maritime industry, Mobile's oysters, which had a world-famous reputation for their succulence and flavor, began a steady decline.
During the Depression years, the local fishermen here and across the bay in Mobile area and Bowler Battery area were able to have a law passed in the state legislature that would stop the grower and everybody from using the dredge. The idea was to limit the amount you would catch to put on the market, which would also hold the price up, which was a real problem for the oyster grower over here because it increased his cost of transplants. He had to use oyster tongs instead of the oyster rake dredge. The causeway was put into Upper Mobile Bay, known as Cochrane Bridge, in the early 1930s, and that slowed down the flow of water that would come out of the rivers leading into Mobile Bay. This created a beginning of a lot of siltation. There was dredge fill put in across most of the area, only with a few openings left for drawbridges. Every time you would have a lot of unusual heavy rains in the spring. This was really a cleansing process or cleaning out of the bay. The causeway slowed this process down. The heavy industries had continued to expand on the rivers leading into Mobile Bay, and there were very few water pollution control laws that would keep this damage down. The Mobile Ship Channel, in its deepening over the years, changed the ecology tremendously. This probably affected it somewhat. What I'm trying to point out to you all is that it just wasn't one thing. The economic situation in the 1930s, the advent of losing the mechanical rake dredge to harvest oysters, along with this siltation, along with many other changes.
After about the 1950s, we didn't have any production coming from this area. The family wasn't producing any of the oysters. We were having to truck them in from Louisiana and Texas. And I was interested in trying to get some homegrown product again. This is an area where my great-grandfather and grandfather grew a lot of oysters. They had plant beds here and closer to the shore. After that, the only method for a while of getting oysters was the tonging over in Bowler Battery area and Cedar Point. This is different entirely because we're using primarily hatchery seed. It's not seed off of a natural bed. This belt system keeps the oysters up off the bottom to keep them out of the sediment. This bottom here would not be productive for oyster culture anymore because it's gotten so silted up and the bottom is so soft that it won't support an oyster. The oyster sinks down in the mud and suffocates. We're trying to raise them all the way to harvest in these bags. There are people that are planting oysters on bottom over in Bile Bantry, Coden area. They have leases of bottom. They're planting directly on hard bottom there that'll support oyster growth. It's really at an experimental or pilot scale now. We're looking at the economics of it, quite frankly. It obviously will grow oysters, and I'd love to see you know, several thousand acres under production out here in Alabama. Could be a real source of oysters in the world. And there's no reason why we can't do it. This bay is tremendously productive. It just simply has changed over the last 50 years, where the old methods aren't going to produce a lot of oysters consistently anymore. And we've got to have some different methods if we're going to get back in the picture of oyster production. And the Alabama oysters used to be very famous. Bon Secours oysters were known worldwide.
In the 20s, speculators tried to promote Dauphin Island as the Atlantic City of the South, and they published some mighty spectacular brochures. But Dauphin Island just wasn't ready for that sort of development. Besides, people were having too much fun doing other things down there.
Before the Dauphin Island Bridge was built, Dauphin Island was really marvelous. That's where the rodeos were held. Now, I was on the deep sea fishing rodeo as a page back in the early 30s, and we would weigh the fish. And Dauphin Island was isolated, and men could go down there and get drunk and raise Cain and not be seen. It was an interesting experience. Tarpon were abundant, and they would catch tarpon anywhere from 90 to 120 pounds. Cavalia were in great abundance. Redfish, sharks, and Albert Gill would go out and bring in a big boat, ray, and his boat would be at about a 20-degree list, hauling that thing in.
And then in the late 1930s, a man by the name of Wayne Palmer came driving across the new causeway and into Mobile with a revolutionary and controversial idea.
One hot summer day, my father was over in Pensacola, coming to Mobile, and this was his first trip to Mobile. And he got virtually to the city of Mobile on the east side of the Mobile River, and then had to go 7 miles around through the Cochran Bridge and down through the not too nice a section of Mobile into the downtown section. And he just thought that something ought to be done, and they needed a crossing there. If you had taken a bridge and put it where the Bankhead Tunnel is now, you would have landed up around Broad Street because of the grades and the heights required for a tunnel, a bridge, so that ships could pass under it, and that would have destroyed Government Street.
Not everybody agreed with Mr. Palmer that a tunnel under the Mobile River was just what the city of Mobile needed. You see, Government Street was lined with grand mansions built primarily with big timber money. When the tunnel opened, Government Street would become Highway 90, and without zoning laws, folks were afraid their elegant residential neighborhood would become blighted with commerce.
One individual said he would never drive through the tunnel, and as far as I know, for years and years, he'd go across the bay, he'd take the old Cochran Bridge, so he did stick by his word on that.
This was the first major tunnel anywhere in this part of the country, and was a very big thing. We have here at the archives all of Roderick McKenzie's drawings of the building of that tunnel.
The tube sections, which comprise or make up the tunnel, were constructed over at Alabama Dry Docks. And we bulkhead them off, in other words, we launch them, and they're sealed. Then we take them out in the river and we sink them and hook one up to another. And then when they're all hooked together, we come and cut out these bulkheads so we can go from one end to another of it. The economy of Mobile was so bad at that point in time, and people had a little bit of money to maybe go to Sanger Theater and try and get some free dishes, and then after the movies or before the movies, they'd all come down and watch the construction of the tunnel. As I said, we worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and the was quite a thing. We'd have as many as 200 people down there, 300 people some night. We didn't give away any dishes like the Sanger Theater did.
It was a festive occasion when the Bankhead Tunnel opened on February the 20th, 1941. From all over the city, people came out to walk from one end of the new tunnel and back. The new artery facilitated the flow of traffic moving people and goods from east to west. The state docks moved the coal and iron and other raw and manufactured products from North Alabama and out into the far corners of the world. This buildup of docks, wharves, railway terminals, and highways all helped make Mobile into one of the nation's most well-equipped and prominent ports, and poised the area for history's next big event.
With a major war in Europe and a major war in the Far East, it was necessary for troops to be moved and supplies. Every man almost would take a boxcar to supply him for a matter of months. And so shipbuilding became a major undertaking in Mobile, with literally thousands of people moving into Mobile. Alabama Dry Dock was putting ships in the water. Gulf Shipbuilding Company was putting ships in the water, and then there were smaller yards which constructed ships.
The USS Hood was one of 7 destroyers built at the shipyard in Chickasaw. Between 1942 and 1945, Mobile shipyards launched 38 naval vessels and about 160 tankers and cargo ships.
The ADSCO put out 1 a week towards the end of the war, and they were slow, simply grocery baskets to get the materials over there. And of course, outside of Mobile, in the Caribbean, there was a tremendous amount of German activity with the submarines. And the anti-submarine warfare in the Caribbean had a high mortality for ships. I don't know how many out of 100 ships were sunk.
I suppose that was part of the fear that there would be an attack along the Gulf Coast, possibly from some of the Central or South American countries as bases. I don't know. There were all kinds of wild talk at that time. There are people who, at Gulf shores particularly, watched ships torpedoed and saw them burn within sight of Gulf shores. The area off the mouth of the Mississippi was known as Torpedo Junction. There were so many ships that were lost there.
So in February 1942, the pilot schooner Alabama was commissioned in the U.S. Coast Guard. Now, in addition to her regular duties, she guided Gulf of Mexico convoys into Mobile Bay, where they could lay overnight in safety before heading out once more into the submarine-infested Gulf.
There was a rash of shipbuilding during World War II. Many of the ships were actually not completed by the time the war was over. And when the war was over, there was no need for the enormous merchant fleet. So the question was what to do with all these ships. So the final decision was that they would be mothballed and that they would be preserved. And the Tensas River was selected as one of the places for one of the mothball fleets. And these ships were collected there. They were lashed together in groups in the river. And it was one of the eerie sights of this area. Eagles moved in, for instance, and built their nests on these ships. And they were simply ghostly. They were deserted here, ship after ship after ship, just row after row of these ships. Gradually, however, they were taken out. Some of them were scrapped, some few of them were put back into operation, some of them were sunk for snapper reefs off the coast, and so the ghost fleet now has disappeared.
Now, a sailor loves a ghost story as much as anybody. One of Mobile Bay's old favorites was the story of the Phantom tugboat. The tug Red Taylor sank a quarter of a mile west of Beacon 12, 20 miles north of the entrance to the bay in January 1952. The wheelhouse was sticking up above the water, so they marked it with a light. But when they came back to salvage her, she wasn't there. Suddenly, beacons and channel markers began to be knocked down all over the bay. The superstitious sailors blamed it all on the Red Taylor.
And the tugboat has become the ghost of Mobile Bay. There are always rumors about its appearing here and appearing there. And it's an interesting, there are very few real maritime ghosts, and so it's nice to have the ghost of a tugboat running around on the bottom of Mobile Bay somewhere. It's never been found.
Long about the time the Red Taylor started knocking down channel markers around the bay, they started building a bridge out to Dauphin Island. It was completed in December of 1955.
Well, after the bridge was built, the island was not achieving the success that had been envisioned by the Chamber of Commerce, and they developed the idea of the Mobile Yacht Club starting this race, and with the Buccaneers and the Fairhope Yacht Club, the three clubs to rotate at its point of origin, and they would sail to Dauphin Island. And it was a marvelous idea, and I guess the first year we maybe had 25 boats, and the second year 30 boats, the third year 35 boats, and some of the fellows were sailing 16-foot light boats that had no business being that far down the bay. But it was a great event and a lot of spirit, and there were times when it took all day and there were times when it took just a few hours. George Brothers, I think, won the first race with a star. They won in the old fish boats. But those days we had day sailors. There were no big boats. They were all just day sailors, 18, 20, 30-foot boats. One time, Wendy Johnson, when he had a sailfish, forgot his mast and had to borrow a piece of standing rigging. I think it was an old oar, and he used that for his mast to sail down there. Oh, he always made it. How'd he do? Everything he did, he might have been last in, but he had the most fun. But the Dauphin Island Regatta is probably today one of the most salubrious occasions on Mobile Bay.
Now, there are 4 yacht clubs on the bay and dozens of regattas annually. But since the first race in 1958, there's nothing to compare with the Dauphin Island Regatta. They say that it's the largest one-day regatta in this hemisphere. It's for sure the most exciting. And the second most exciting thing on Mobile Bay is the sound of folks yelling, "Jubilee!"
When people on the Eastern Shore hear the word Jubilee, it has real meaning, and it has had a meaning for at least a century or more in Mobile Bay. And basically, it is a party. The fish, the bottom fish, principally crabs, flounder, shrimp, these are all quite edible along with a number of other species, move in response to low oxygen water pockets that form in the bottom of Mobile Bay during the warm summer months when it's relatively stagnant. And what happens is that the wind starts blowing across Baldwin County from the east, and it shoves the water from the eastern side of the bay to the western side on the surface. This forces water on the bottom to move toward Baldwin County. And in doing this, the animals that are pretty much oriented toward being on the bottom simply flee in front of the low oxygen water, the stagnant water. And finally, at certain places along the bay, if the pocket of water is large enough, the animals literally get pushed up onto the beach. And this usually happens during warm summer months at night when there hasn't been much oxygen delivered by the plant system.
The last of June and say the 1st of July, you start looking for them. Oh, just pick out what you want. Didn't even have to have a soup net. All sizes, and right on the water there, are schools or shrimp. Next place there's a school of fish, and you go a little further, there's a flounder. Or if not that, you get 2 flounders at one time, where they slide in over top of one another.
They literally come up on the beach
in numbers, and these are principally flounder and crab and shrimp, all edible and highly desirable food items, and it brings on a real party. People on the Eastern Shore spread the word, and everybody shows up with baskets, and they gather up all the seafood they can.
But they usually come in on the incoming tide go back out, they go with the tide. Only thing is, you leave from here to go up on the hill to call your friends, and when you get back, it's nothing, and your friends don't get nothing. And so you do better to catch them and throw them out on the beach and come back along and pick them up. And that way your friends will have some. But everybody want to see it, you know.
And there was not a hurricane to strike directly on Mobile until Frederick in 1979. And of course, a lot of people said that the reason we didn't get a hurricane from 26 to 79 was because Archbishop Tulin came here and ran the hurricanes off. It's difficult to disprove such a claim. Certainly there were no hurricanes and there was Archbishop Tulin, but whether he ever actually took credit for it, I don't know. But the effect of that was that the city's trees got to grow and everything for 50 years, so that when a hurricane hit, and Frederick, when it hit Mobile, hit with far less power or with less power than 1916 and probably 1906 storm. But it did a great deal more damage in the city because the trees and everything else had 50 years of hurricane-free growth, and they were easy prey for the storms. And so the damage as a result was very, very severe throughout the city. There were fewer ships in the harbor, and so the damage to the waterfront and ships was negligible by comparison to the damage to the city itself.
I like to think of Hurricane Frederick as a little bit of heaven and a little bit of hell. The hell was naturally what took place above sea level. The heaven was what took place below sea level, wherein the muds of Mobile Bay were resuspended by the anti-clockwise winds and blown out of the bay to the extent of 295 million tons. And these 295 million tons carried with them a substantial amount of the contamination which had beset Mobile Bay. At that time, right after the hurricane, Mobile Bay was maybe not any better than most of the other bays in the Northern Gulf, but certainly no worse. In 15 years, basically what has happened to the bay is that it's begun getting dirtier and dirtier again, because these, every single day, every hour of the day, we're getting discharge into the bay. Every day we get an average rate of 72,000 cubic feet per second of water coming into that bay, and that water is carrying contaminants and industrial, municipal effluent from 2/3 of the state of Alabama and portions of neighboring Tennessee, Mississippi, and Georgia as well.
Everything that we put on the land and everything that we put into the water eventually makes its way down to the estuary. One of the problems has been that since the Clean Water Act was passed and a lot of other federal legislation was passed back in the 60s and early 70s, we've had people with the idea that since there's a federal law and there are state laws, that the federal government and the state governments are handling the water pollution issues and the habitat destruction problems. And that is really to the detriment of the resource. I think without local governments and the public getting involved in these issues, we're going to continue to see declines in the health of the nation's estuaries.
Say from a little kid, I used to come down with my mother fishing. Just with a string pole, fishing off the beach. And the short pills, it wasn't these long pills. Oh, it was good. Other words, every time we come, get a meal. That's what we went fishing for, to get supper. I've been fishing, say, regular since the 40s, late 40s. And it's been pretty good fishing. till up lately. Well, it's mostly corrosion or dispersion or something of the water. The grass is nothing for the fish to hide in, or shrimp, you know, to hide in. It's just costs lesser fish. No grass, no ducks, and nothing. In other words, the water just says a starvation water.
One of the problems that we're having along the coast right now, especially along the eastern shore and in Baldwin County, is the rapid development. There's a population explosion. A lot of folks want to come in and get a view of the water. And the first people that came into the area got the high ground. They got the best lots. Now we're developing marginal lots, and we're developing areas that are marginal at best as far as the development is concerned. Several years ago, I was involved in mapping some of the grass beds in Baldwin County, and we found out that we could find grass beds on the natural beach, the natural area where you have the marsh. You'd find the submerged grass beds. But where you have bulkheads and where you have seawalls, you don't find the grass bed. And someone says, well, I do not want my investment to wash away, so I'm going to build a small little bulkhead. So when that happens, then the neighbor has to build one, because the adjoining property starts to erode away, and pretty soon you have wall-to-wall seawalls. And pretty soon you have wall-to-wall people along the shoreline of the bay. Weeks Bay is a part of Mobile Bay, and it's a very shallow area. But the marsh grass and the submerged grass beds are places where the seafood grows up and hides and develops. Estuaries are, from a biological standpoint, among the most productive places on Earth. More protein is produced per acre in an estuary and in a salt marsh than you have in a wheat field in the midwestern part of the United States. So from a biological standpoint, it makes sense to preserve estuaries, and that's why Weeks Bay was established as the nation's 16th National Estuarine Research Reserve. This is one of the bright spots in Baldwin County. Much of the shoreline of Weeks Bay is going to be as is for the foreseeable future. It's not going to be developed.
Mobile Bay is a drowned river valley estuary, and as such extremely shallow. Historically, to move ships in and out of Mobile Bay, we'd have to dredge the channel. And that's true today. The channel is dredged constantly, and the major problem that we have is what to do with the dredge spoil. In the past, one of the methods of dealing with dredge spoil was to pile it right along the edge of the channel. But hurricanes proved that that was not a very successful idea, because the dredge spoil ended up back in the channel. The modern day technology has advanced us into creating, within the bay system, islands of dredge spoil material. We are on Gilliard Island, right in Mobile Bay, about 4 miles off of the main ship channel. And what we have here is an island created by the Army Corps of Engineers to receive dredge materials for the next 50 years. The island had a secondary use, unplanned by the Corps, and that is the avian fauna. The avian fauna found this to be a very wonderful site for both nesting, resting, and feeding. In the early 70s, the brown pelican and many other coastal birds were suffering declines in their population. Scientists investigating this phenomena found out that the problem associated with these coastal birds was linked to agricultural practices inland, in that DDT, a form of insecticide, was washed out of the farmlands into streams, rivers, and down into these estuarine waters. Incorporated into body tissues, the net result was the lack of a hard shell in these birds like the brown pelican. Populations crashed to near levels of extinction. Through major efforts of conservation groups, the federal government banning the use of DDTs, these populations of birds have now recovered into thriving numbers, utilizing areas like Gilliard Island as nesting sites and growing in population. We now have a standing population of somewhere between 1,500 and 1,800 brown pelican pairs, and they grow yearly. They utilize the waters of Mobile Bay and the estuarine environment around it to feed themselves and the young. This Mobile Bay estuary is a very rich and very valuable estuary in natural resources and the economics that it brings in to the community of Mobile. In Bayou La Batterie alone, over $500 million worth of shrimp a year are caught and exported out of these estuarine waters. The rich waters, although murky brown in color, provide this natural environment with a multitude of food. But also below our waters here is the richest natural gas field found in the continental United States. In the inshore rigs known as the Mary Ann Field, the wells are down at 27,000 feet in the sediment, producing natural gas that will last for the next 30 to 40 years and supply the United States with energy for years and years to come. This basin here, the Drowned River Valley of Mobile Bay, drains 20% of the rivers and streams of the United States. And now, with the advent of the Tombigbee Waterway, we are getting drainage basins out of the Ohio Valley as well. The natural current system right off our shoreline actually moves the sediments that come out of Mobile Bay from the east to the west. The island itself, this island, Dolphin Island, is an island that has a bedrock base, but the sands around it are mobile sands, that travel hundreds of miles down the river system to be deposited here on our beaches. The beauty of this area, the beauty of Dolphin Island, and the beauty of Mobile is linked to our environment. It's linked to this bay, to the murky waters of the bay, to the Gulf of Mexico. What happens to the ecology of Mobile Bay and the river flow and the inputs into the bay affects the entire ecosystem of the Gulf of Mexico. When you have population and industrial growth in and around the waterway, the effluent from the businesses and from the populations have to go into the marine ecosystem. And what we have out here is a natural bay system that has an assimilative capacity. That means it can absorb a tremendous amount of pollutants and waste that come into the system. Unfortunately, in natural systems like ours, there are no warning signs that tell us when the system is near full or when the system is close to being collapsed because of all the influence that comes into the bay. This rich environmental system right here of Mobile Bay is very viable right now. And as such, we use the Chesapeake to compare what happened there so that it doesn't happen in our system.
On Mobile Bay, honey stole my heart away beside the sea when she gave a loving kiss to me. She said goodbye while the moon was shining high on the dreaming, beaming, gleaming Mobile Bay.
When I was a kid, I remember going to restaurants in other parts of the country, and you could see on the menu bond secure oysters. And I would like to think that our children and our grandchildren would someday be able to go to restaurants all over the country and still see that bond secure oysters.
So folks generally keep coming down to the bay for the same reasons they did 10,000 years ago. Because they like to eat oysters, and they like to fish, and they can put their boats in it, or just their feet, and because like a rusty old shrimper or a sleek racing yacht, this muddy old estuary is absolutely beautiful to look upon. That's the way it was on Mobile Bay.
If you have comments or want information about how to obtain copies of any of the programs in this series, write to Public Television Services Mobile, 700 Donald Street, Mobile, Alabama 36617, or call 1-800-239-5233.
Together now, we can make it better now. Come on, can we do it? Yeah, you know that we can. We'll rope it up, cause we know how to jump. We'll roll it out, cause we know how to skate. We'll cut it down, cause we know what to eat. We'll swap it out, we eat healthy stuff. Can we do it? Yeah, you know that we can. Can we do it? Yeah, you know that we can. Yeah, well come on.
Today's a good day to grab your kids and hang out with them for an hour. Dance, walk, play a sport, or cook a healthy meal. Because just moving a little and eating better every day can help make you and your child healthier.
Can we do it? Yeah, you know that we can. We'll ball it up, cause we know how to hoop. We'll mess around, cause we know how to play. We'll drop it down, cause we know how to dance. We'll veg it up, veggie night and day. Can we do it? Yeah, you know that we can. All in together now, we can make it better now.
Search We Can to find doable tips and activities that you can use every day to keep you and your kids healthy.
I'm one unlucky guy. The chance of being involved in a robbery is 1 in 757. The chances of being struck by lightning 1 in 750,000.
Please fasten your seatbelts for unexpected turbulence.
The chances of being a victim in an airline crash 1 in 29 million. Hey, could I get some peanuts? The chances of being involved in a car crash are far greater than lightning strikes and plane crashes. And if you are texting while driving, your risk of crash increases 23 times. Now, I may be an unlucky guy, but I don't have to be part of that statistic, and neither do you. Drive responsibly.
Nationwide, an average of 24 children die each year.
And another 17,000 are injured in bus-related accidents.
Many of these can be prevented. The safety of our children comes first.
For the safety of our future, obey all traffic laws related to school bus safety.
Hi, I'm Pat Mitchell, Director of Transportation for the Mobile County Public School System. We're asking you to obey all bus safety laws. It could save a life. Remember, stop ahead when you see red. Our future depends on it.
In an ever-changing, high-tech global economy, technical know-how is a must. And preparing students to meet those demands is what we do. With more than 150 class choices available, let us help you find an interest to jumpstart your career. Career Technical Education. It's not college, it's high school. Learn today's high-tech skills and get prepared for career and beyond.